The fleece stays on until it stops being cold. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Hey everyone, CW Music here. I'm CWD, and we're going to take a gander at this new track from Mount Eerie called Distortion. Mount Eerie is the indie rock, indie folk, experimental rock project fronted by singer-songwriter, producer, multi-instrumentalist Phil Elverum. Phil has been making music for quite a while now. A lot of people know Phil for the group The Microphones, who dropped one of the best indie rock albums, lo-fi music albums of the 2000s, Glow Part 2. The Microphones then disbanded and I guess kind of reformed to become Mount Eerie. And since then they've been dropping albums left and right, kind of exploring all these different styles, namely ambient, some noise, and there's actually one album where he delves in black metal called Wind's Poem. Last year was also a big year for Mount Eerie. Phil dropped an album called A Crow Looked at Me, which was one of my top 5 favorite albums of last year. It wasn't doing anything that was too different from the indie folk that Phil has dropped as Mount Eerie and as The Microphones. Solid folk compositions, and the concept behind that was pretty tragic. The album pretty much highlighted the grief that he was feeling following the death of his wife, Genevieve Castray. I completely butchered her name all throughout the review for A Crow Looked at Me when I did it, so I deeply apologize for that. And what Phil essentially did on that album was redefine not just what it means to feel grief, but also reset the standard as to how one writes about death. To be fair, he didn't mean to do this. All he was doing was sublimating all these different songs following the death of his wife. Because music is one of the biggest balms of any kind of pain you can feel. And basically, for whatever reason, he decided to put all this in one album and have it released for everybody to hear. And it was so weird because I felt like an intruder when I was listening to the album. The album did grow on me a lot since hearing it, and it makes me even more interested and dumbfounded with what Phil as Mount Eerie has been doing since then. Especially now that I heard that there's going to be a new album coming out in March, literally not even a whole year after the release of A Crow Looked at Me. From what I understand, he started making this new album titled Now Only right after the release of A Crow Looked at Me. The album itself being 6 tracks and 40 minutes in length, so that's going to be pretty interesting. This new song, this lead single to the album, Distortion, is about 11 minutes. And it is also, coincidentally, a fantastic song, and weirdly enough is better than anything he put out on A Crow Looked at Me. And let me explain to you why that's weird. People had an anticipation for that album, and they were going to rank it when it comes to what Mount Eerie and The Microphones have put out, but A Crow Looked at Me had no standard or anything. It just was. I mean, the album was still great, don't get me wrong, but the album still just was. Like, the album didn't exist as a sort of artistic project or as a sort of artistic experimentation or anything of that nature. The album just existed. Phil crafted these songs following the death of his wife, and he didn't intend for these to be put into a whole album and then dissected by any reviewer like myself to get their hands on. I don't feel like he meant to do that, since he described the album as not even music at all. He just so happened to create this sort of thing, and coincidentally it ended up being not just one of the best albums of 2017, but one of the greatest singer-songwriter albums of the decade. And I think this album has since then been very vital to how one writes about death. I think the album itself is going to change a lot of people's perspectives on how to go about crafting songs or any kind of art about loss, grief, death, and all that. I mean, that's me claiming a lot, boasting a lot in the defense of what Phil has made, but still, if you've not heard this album, you need to. And with this track here, I think he's going for kind of more of the same with that regard, but going above and beyond in terms of not just the lyrical description, but also the instrumentation. Instrumentally, I thought this was going to be a doom metal song. Holy crap! Just how thick and really menacing the opening guitar drone was made me really, honest to God, think that the song was going to be a doom metal song, and given the fact that it's only 6 tracks and the album itself being 40 minutes, I thought the whole album might be a doom metal album. But lo and behold, acoustic guitar comes in and the occasional piano chord and all that goes wistfully all throughout the 11 minutes it goes for, and it's probably not going to be a doom metal album, unfortunately. But still, the song itself is compositionally impenetrable. In a way, it kind of reminds me of Ravens off of A Crow Looked at Me, the way the acoustic guitar just holds up in a sort of fluttering and mid-paced fashion. And it just goes pretty well all throughout the 11 minutes it runs for, and I love it instrumentally. Now, lyrically is where the song shines. Essentially, he talks about, all throughout the track, the concept of memory in terms of holding on to someone else's existence after they're dead within memory. He asks the question, is it now my job to hold on to what's left of you until I'm dead so I can reenact your memory for our daughter? Is that now my duty throughout the course of my life? And I think he splits the lyrical composition into maybe 3 parts. This prologue, the first dead body he's ever seen, and then the second one he's ever seen. The first dead body he's ever seen was his great-grandfather, already embalmed and all that and put in a coffin, and he was just a little kid. Before then, he was telling his mother that he wanted to be remembered. Not famous, but a little more significant, so that way he lasts longer than his actual end. And until the point where he actually sees his dead grandfather, he spends his life wondering what mortality was. I like this line at the very end of when he's describing the funeral and how they were reading a verse out of the Bible about the valley and the shadow of death, but he wasn't imagining all this sort of allegorical and metaphorical stuff that this particular moment in Scripture is talking about. Because, and I quote the song here, "But that dead body next to me spoke clear and metaphor-free." Death in itself is just is. Once you're dead, you're dead. There's nothing romantic or metaphorical or poetic about death. It just is. The song then goes into this sort of weird and actually very interesting narrative about how he feels about people that abandon their children or neglect being fathers. Because he talks about the time where he spent a good chunk of the latter half of 2001 following 9/11 just meandering around the States, living lonely and not having like any kind of thing infringe his freedom, and then all of a sudden that kind of gets torn apart when there's a pregnancy scare with this girl he only met one night and had no intention of ever being with or learning about. And he starts seeing like all his like ancestors and descendants looking down on him. He starts seeing like his whole life unraveling before his eyes as if he's actually going to be dead or something. But then he learns that the woman has a period, and he says that he went back to being this chauvinistic 23-year-old loner. Fast forward a decade later, he's watching this documentary about Jack Kerouac, and it gets to the point where Jan Kerouac, his daughter, doesn't really talk about his dad as if he's like some legend. He talks about him like he's a deadbeat that did nothing but drink and watch the Stooges and revel in his own mythology. Within this documentary, he starts seeing a little bit of his own wife in her. That all of a sudden like brought it back home to him and puts everything in more perspective. Like at a certain point, he could have done to this one random encounter what some father did to his own wife when she was growing up, which is pretty fucking wild. Then it goes on to how the second dead body he's ever seen was his own wife. And instead of her being embalmed and pretty much hidden away and all that crap, he talks about how he actually saw her go from alive to dead right before his eyes. And then he talks about how eventually he will be in that same moment where he'll be dead, and within other people he will be embodied as memories in other people before they die, and then all that's lost and everything just becomes nothing but distortion. I had one takeaway from the track that is different from what A Crow Looked at Me was. He's not so much talking about the grief he's feeling from the death of his wife anymore. He's more so reflecting on what death and memory actually is. And he does that so fantastically well all throughout the song. And it leaves me speechless every time I listen to the song, and I'm going to be super excited to hear how he's going to take this concept and expand it into a 6-track, 40-minute album. Which is weird, because this sort of music would not have happened without the death of his wife. And it's mind-boggling to think about. This sort of lyrical avenue that has been opened up to Phil because of this horrible thing that happened to him. I think this is a great song, and I definitely am looking forward to this album, and I still love A Crow Looked at Me, but I'm just kind of emotionally conflicted about all this. I don't know. Needless to say, though, the song itself is furthering this sort of venture that Phil is taking in when it comes to how he's feeling about death and memory and grief, and it makes me highly anticipate what he's going to do with the album come March. If you've given this track a listen, what'd you think of it? Did you dislike this track? Did you like this track? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? It's CW Music here, signing off.